and it's in the bulletin as well.
All right. Scripture reading, Luke 6:27 through 38. To those who hear me, I say, love your enemies. Do good to those who hate you. Bless those who curse you, and pray for those who mistreat you. When they slap you on one cheek, turn and give them the other. When they take your coat,
a coat.
Let them have your shirt as well. Give to all who beg from you. When someone takes what is yours, don't demand it back. Do to others what you would have them do to you. If you love those who love you, what credit does that do to you? Even sinners love those who love them. If you do good only to those who do good to you, what credit does that do to you? Even sinners do as much. If you lend to those you expect to repay you, what credit does that do you? Even sinners lend to other sinners, expecting to be repaid in full. Love your enemies and do good to them. Lend without expecting repayment, and your reward will be great. You'll rightly be called children of the Most High, since God is good even to the ungrateful and the wicked. Be compassionate as your loving God is compassionate. Don't judge, and you won't be judged. Don't condemn, and you won't be condemned. Pardon, and you'll be pardoned. Give, and it will be given to you. A full measure, packed down, shaken together, and running over, will be poured into your lap. For the amount you measure out is the amount you'll be given back.
Wow, I love that reading. Thank you. Felt that. Okay, Christy.
Indeed, I will echo that. That was wonderful and good visuals. Thank you, Gary and Ellen, for your creativity. These are some hard words from Jesus in this sermon on the plain from Luke's gospel. Last week, you all heard Jane preach on the blessings and the woes. And these verses that we heard read this morning come right after the woe to you who are. And then we get these verses. Love your enemies. Do good to those who hate you. Pray for those who mistreat you. Don't judge. Don't condemn. Turn the other cheek. When someone takes your coat, give them your shirt as well. There is a lot in these verses we heard from Jesus. So much that could be and needs to be unpacked. But what kept jumping out to me as I was reading these words was two sections. Love your enemies, which shows up towards the beginning and then also towards the end, and pray for those who mistreat you. But before getting into focusing on just those two lines, I want to name something about these verses as a whole. These verses have led to and can lead to harm. And Jesus is not saying here, to you who are suffering and who are oppressed, just suck it up and let people walk all over you. In fact, Jesus is saying quite the opposite. And this is important to name because these verses have been used to harm people who have been abused. To say the Christian thing to do is to forgive your abuser, to turn the other cheek. But this is not what Jesus is saying, and these verses should not be used that way. So I'll say a bit more about this later, but I just wanted to name that at the beginning. So back to love your enemies. I may have mentioned that the Idaho Mennonite pastors have been gathering every few months, and we're very slowly reading our way through and discussing Melissa Floor Bixler, who's a Mennonite pastor. She has this new book, How to Have an Enemy, Righteous Anger and the Work of Peace. And the Idaho Mennonite pastors just met last week. And so I had her words in mind as I read these verses again. Love your enemies. Pray for those who mistreat you. Sometimes these declarations from Jesus feel like feel-good things to say about ourselves. We seek to love our enemies, to do good to those who harm us, to lend without expecting repayment. From my position in life, I haven't often felt what it's like to have personal enemies. Sure, there are systemic and structural forces at work that sometimes feel like enemies, but I'm not sure I fully understood what it feels like to be stuck in a system that is perpetuating harm, or to feel like your voice doesn't matter and you are helpless. And I will very clearly name that is thanks to my privileged position in life as a white woman walking through the world with resources, generational wealth, education, the list could go on. But I started feeling a bit of what it may feel like to have an enemy in these years of Trumpism, and frankly, in these very divisive pandemic days. As I had these words of Jesus rolling around in my being, I walked into a grocery store during our time away last weekend. And it was pretty crowded and most people weren't wearing masks. And I had also just read the news that vaccines for under 5-year-olds had been delayed. And those 2 weeks where I felt a weight lifting off of me with the hope of a vaccine sooner quickly faded. And the burden of being a parent of an unvaccinated child quickly returned. So I was in this mental state that I was walking through the aisles, feeling angry that so many people weren't wearing masks and feeling a panic rising in me that I should just rush out of there. And then my anger turned to sadness. Sadness that now my initial reaction to another person is whether or not they're wearing a mask, whether or not my child is safe being in the same room with another human, whether or not I can be in the same room and not bring the virus home to my child. Enemy feels like too strong of a word for this, but that feeling where all my defenses go up seems to fit here. And what's at the root of this for me is a care of others, a concern for the good of all. And wearing a mask is a really small example, but I've realized over the past 2 years that the feelings I have had of helplessness to keep myself and my family safe is the reality that Indigenous people, Black people, people of color, people in the LGBTQIA community feel constantly. They live and breathe in a constant threat of their personhood being taken away. Not by a virus, though also that, but by systems of oppression set up against them, set up to keep them out and keep the dominant culture in control. In the past few years, and I'll say it's definitely been highlighted for me since moving to Idaho, is the way that we have become a country of us and them, of blue and red, of division. As people who seek to follow Jesus's teaching, we lean into asking, what does it mean to stand with the oppressed, those whose voices are getting taken away? We need to center the experience of the oppressed. And we need to love the oppressor too. We need to love those we disagree with, not to say what they're doing is okay, and not to say we agree with them, but to say you also are a beloved one of God. And to remember that our liberation is wrapped up with one another. Jesus here is inviting us into a third way of being, inviting us to imagine a different way of interacting with one another, to not stay in this us-them mentality. As Melissa Flohr-Bixler says in her book, in Christianity, we don't resolve enmity by destroying our foes or finding middle ground with them. Instead, Jesus ushers a different system, a new way of living that changes the order of power itself. Jesus is calling us out of systems of harm and calling us to be creative. Jesus was saying these words to people who were living under an oppressive Roman Empire. They were used to Roman soldiers bullying them. They lived with trauma and violence all around them. When Jesus says, turn the other cheek, he wasn't saying, take a passive stance, but actually saying, take an act of resistance. If a Roman soldier were to slap you on the cheek, they would then expect it to be the end of it. A slap is an act of control. And so to turn the other cheek would be to throw the soldier off. You aren't supposed to respond. As Rowan William points out, the world of the aggressor, the master, is questioned because the person who's supposed to take no initiative suddenly does. This goes into Jesus's other comments as well. When they take your coat, give them your shirt also. In that time, nakedness was a shameful thing for the person who saw the other who was naked, not for the naked person. And so if the soldier asks for the coat and you then give them your shirt as well, you would be naked and it would shame the soldier. It would remind them, you too are a human. And so too, this is an act of resistance. Jesus is saying, don't respond to violence and oppression with passive acceptance, but get creative. Remind them of your humanity. Loving one's neighbor is to say, I won't play into a system that tells me we are against each other. In loving my enemies, I will seek justice for all and remember that our liberation is wrapped up with one another. We cannot be free until we are all free. Until the roots of patriarchy, white supremacy, colonialism, and capitalism are dug up, lamented, repented, and healed. Until that, none, including the oppressors, will be free. These years of pandemic of an ever-divided country, I have felt anger in a new way, and I've wondered what to do with it and how to hold it. And these words of enemy love and praying for those who mistreat you are oddly comforting. It doesn't mean I have to be okay with what's happening, and it doesn't mean I should stop crying out and lamenting injustice, but it does mean that I get to remember that each and every person is a beloved one of God, and that God can hold my anger too. Over the past few weeks, I've joined the Interfaith Equity Coalition group on Wednesdays at noon to stand together on the steps of the Capitol in silent prayer for 30 minutes. And this past week, I went right after reading about a pro-militia bill that was going through a hearing in the House, reading about an abortion bill similar to the one in Texas being considered. I went and gathered with others on the steps to hold space, to pause, to pray, to be a presence saying, remember, we are all beloveds. We are all human. I find these 30 minutes of standing at the Capitol with others and watching as people walk by and in and out of the building to be healing for me. To remember that even those standing inside who are working for bills and laws that I vehemently disagree with, they too are human. And my prayer on those steps has been, may peace and peace and peace come. And I repeat those words over and over as I stand there. I think this is what Jesus was thinking about as he invites us to pray for those who mistreat us. In Melissa's book, she has a whole chapter on praying for your enemies. And she points out that the Psalms of lament, the Psalms of rage and vengeance that we don't often read in church are prayers that hold space, that give words to the unspeakable. Praying for our enemies is a way to release, a way to express our rage and anger to God and to then release to God. As she says, the Psalms of rage remind us that somehow, in spite of absolute defeat, someone dared to say out loud, the world is not as it should be. And that is what I believe Jesus is saying here. Pray for those who mistreat you. Declare the world is not as it should be. And don't let that anger fester within you. Speak your rage, speak your anger to a God who loves you and who loves your enemy, and a God who can take your anger. Release it so that you can move and be in the world, to imagine a new way of being, to live creatively, and to work with others to birth the reign of God into being. And so, church, may you love your enemies this week and pray for those who mistreat you and work toward the wholeness and liberation for all. May it be so.